At 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, a 20-millimeter German cannon shell ripped through the tail section of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 24,000 feet, tearing into the flesh of a 19-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin who refused to stop firing his twin 50-caliber machine guns, even as his blood sprayed across the frozen metal walls of his compartment. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran squeezed the triggers harder, watching his tracers arc toward the Messerschmitt fighters swarming around his crippled bomber like sharks circling wounded prey. Another shell punched through the aluminum fuselage 6 inches from his head. Then another struck his right forearm, shattering bone. He kept shooting. When a third round tore into his left arm, destroying the muscles that controlled his fingers, he wedged his shattered limbs against the gun handles and used the weight of his body to keep the barrels pointed at the enemy. And when the entire front section of his bomber broke away and tumbled toward the German countryside 4 miles below, leaving him trapped in a severed tail section with no parachute and 90 seconds to live, Eugene Moran did something that defied every law of physics and human survival. He kept fighting all the way down. This is the story of how a nobody became the most insane survivor in World War II history. A farm boy who fell 24,000 feet without a parachute and lived to tell about it. One of only 3 men in the entire war who accomplished this impossible feat. But survival was just the beginning of his nightmare. The 8th Air Force was dying over Germany in the autumn of 1943. The numbers told a story of industrial-scale slaughter that would make even hardened military commanders question whether the bombing campaign could continue. Between August and October, American heavy bombers flew deep into German territory without fighter escort, and the Luftwaffe tore them apart with systematic efficiency. The mission to Schweinfurt on October 14th cost 60 flying fortresses in a single afternoon. 600 men killed or captured in 6 hours. 600 families receiving telegrams that began with the words every American mother dreaded. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. A bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to go home. Statistical analysis showed the average crew lasted 15 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Some bomb groups were losing half their aircraft every month. Replacement crews arrived from the United States with fresh faces and new uniforms, and within weeks they were either dead or prisoners of war. The problem was not courage or skill or determination. American airmen were among the bravest men in uniform. Volunteers who climbed into aluminum coffins and flew into flak-filled skies because someone had to destroy the factories that fed Hitler's war machine. The problem was simple geometry. German fighters had learned that attacking a B-17 formation from directly behind put them in the firing arc of only one man, the tail gunner. Every other defensive position on the bomber covered different angles. The top turret protected against attacks from above. The ball turret handled threats from below. The waist gunners covered the sides. The nose gunner dealt with head-on approaches. But when a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf came screaming in from 6 o'clock low, diving up from behind and beneath the bomber, only the tail gunner could stop them. And German pilots knew this weakness better than the Americans did. The tail gunner position was the loneliest job in military aviation. The man who occupied that cramped metal compartment sat on a bicycle-style seat at the very back of the aircraft, separated from his crewmates by 40 feet of fuselage. No conversation, no company. Just the roar of engines, the whistle of wind through gaps in the aluminum skin, and the constant scanning of empty sky for the black dots that meant death was coming. The tail gunner had 2 50-caliber machine guns, 2,000 rounds of ammunition, an oxygen mask that fed him precious air at altitudes where human blood begins to boil, and an electrically heated suit that barely kept hypothermia at bay when temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. He sat backward, watching the world recede, watching for the fighters that would try to kill him first, because killing the tail gunner meant the entire formation became vulnerable. November 1943 brought no relief to the dying bomber crews. The target list remained as demanding as ever. German industrial cities, aircraft factories, submarine pens, ball bearing plants, oil refineries. Every target was defended by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and squadrons of experienced Luftwaffe pilots who had been fighting since 1939. The men climbing into B-17s that autumn knew the odds. They knew most of them would not complete their 25 missions. They knew friends who had left on morning raids and never returned. They climbed into the aircraft anyway, because the war would not win itself. Eugene Paul Moran had enlisted the day he turned 18 years old. Growing up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, he had spent his childhood watching aircraft pass overhead and dreaming of flight in the way that farm boys dream of escaping the endless cycle of plowing and planting and harvesting. The Army Air Forces needed gunners desperately. Young men with quick reflexes, steady nerves, good eyesight, and the ability to keep functioning when every instinct screamed to curl into a ball and hide. Farm boys made excellent gunners. They knew how to shoot. They knew how to work with their hands. They knew how to follow orders and keep working when conditions turned miserable. Gunnery training transformed Moran from a Wisconsin farm boy into a precision killer. Instructors taught him to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind speed, altitude, air temperature, and the movement of his own aircraft. They taught him to fire in short, controlled bursts, because sustained fire would overheat his barrels and jam his guns at the worst possible moment. They drilled him on aircraft recognition until he could identify German fighters by silhouette at 2,000 yards. Messerschmitt Bf-109, with its squared wingtips and narrow fuselage. Focke-Wulf 190, with its radial engine and broader stance. He learned their attack patterns, their favorite approaches, their weaknesses. The training was comprehensive and thorough, an utterly inadequate preparation for actual combat. Nothing could prepare a 19-year-old for the reality of combat at 24,000 feet over Germany. The cold that turned fingers black inside heated gloves. The thin air that made every movement feel like swimming through syrup. The flak bursts that filled the sky with black clouds of shrapnel moving at supersonic speeds. The sight of a B-17 taking a direct hit and folding in half like a broken toy, spilling bodies into space, some with parachutes that opened, most without. The German fighters that came in waves, firing 20-millimeter cannons that could punch through aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. Training taught mechanics and tactics. Only experience taught terror. Moran arrived in England in October 1943 and was assigned to the 96th Bomb Group stationed at Snetterton Heath. The 96th was one of many bomb groups that formed the backbone of the 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men, all dedicated to the single mission of destroying Germany's ability to wage war by obliterating its industrial infrastructure one bombing run at a time. The new arrivals were processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Uniforms issued, quarters assigned, equipment distributed, medical examinations completed, and then the waiting began. Experienced crews could spot the new men instantly. Fresh faces that had not yet learned the 1,000-yard stare. Uniforms that still fit properly because their wearers had not yet lost 20 pounds to stress and inadequate rations. Eyes that still showed curiosity instead of the dead exhaustion that came from flying mission after mission after mission into skies filled with metal and fire. The veterans did not talk much to the new arrivals. Why bother learning names when half of them would be dead within a month? But something had to change, because the losses could not continue. Bomber Command knew this. The statisticians knew this. Even the crews climbing into their aircraft every morning knew this. The strategic bombing campaign was supposed to cripple German war production, but it was crippling the 8th Air Force just as badly. At current loss rates, the entire bomber force would be destroyed before achieving its objectives. Something had to change, or the entire strategy would collapse under the weight of its own casualties. And change was coming, though nobody at Snetterton Heath knew it yet. Deep in the bureaucratic machinery of military planning, decisions were being made that would alter the course of the air war over Europe. New tactics were being developed. New aircraft were being designed. New strategies were being tested that would tip the balance away from the defenders and toward the bombers. But these changes would come too late for many crews. Too late for the men scheduled to fly on November 29, 1943. Too late for the crew of a B-17 named Ricky Tikki-Tavi. The bomber itself was unremarkable. A standard B-17G Flying Fortress, serial number unknown to history because it would not survive long enough to become famous. 4 Wright R1820 Cyclone engines producing 1,200 horsepower each. Empty weight of 36,000 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds when loaded with fuel, bombs, ammunition, and crew. Defensive armament consisting of 13 50-caliber machine guns distributed across 7 positions. Operational ceiling of 35,000 feet, though most missions were flown between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, where the air was dense enough to provide some protection against fighter attacks, while thin enough to make anti-aircraft fire less accurate. 10 men crewed the aircraft. First lieutenant in the left seat as aircraft commander. Second lieutenant in the right seat as co-pilot. Navigator and bombardier sharing the nose section, with its clear plexiglass panels that offered spectacular views and zero protection. Flight engineer doubling as top turret gunner. Radio operator positioned behind the bomb bay. 2 waist gunners standing at open windows on either side of the fuselage, exposed to wind and cold and enemy fire. Ball turret gunner suspended beneath the aircraft in a rotating glass sphere barely large enough to contain a human being. And Eugene Moran in the tail, alone with his guns and his thoughts, and the certainty that German fighters would try to kill him first. The mission brief on the morning of November 29th was straightforward. The target was Bremen, an industrial city on the Weser River in northwestern Germany. Shipyards that built submarines, aircraft factories that produced fighters, machine shops that manufactured components for tanks and artillery. The kind of target that justified sending 300 heavy bombers and 3,000 men into hostile airspace, despite knowing that dozens would not return. The briefing officer pointed to maps and photographs, flak concentrations marked in red, fighter bases circled in black, escape routes highlighted in blue, expected casualties estimated at 5 to 8%, acceptable losses in the cold mathematics of strategic warfare. Moran listened to the briefing and felt his stomach tighten. This was it. His first combat mission. All the training, all the preparation, all the nervous anticipation, condensed into a single morning where he would either perform his job or die trying. The other crew members showed varying degrees of concern. The veterans displayed studied indifference, checking equipment with the bored efficiency of men who had seen this routine dozens of times. The newer members showed signs of stress. Hands that moved too quickly, eyes that would not focus, voices pitched slightly higher than normal. Everyone dealt with fear differently. The only universal constant was that everyone was afraid. But Moran did not have time to dwell on fear, because the mission was launching, and there were pre-flight checks to complete, and equipment to verify, and a tail gunner position to occupy. He climbed aboard Rikki-Tikki-Tavi through the waist door, squeezed past the radio operator's station, crawled over the tail wheel housing, and settled into his position at the very back of the aircraft. The compartment was exactly as cramped and uncomfortable as training had promised. The bicycle seat offered minimal padding. The twin .50 caliber guns filled most of the available space. Ammunition boxes were stacked within arm's reach. The plexiglass panels that formed the tail cone were already frosted with condensation, despite the aircraft still being on the ground. Moran connected his oxygen mask and tested the flow, connected his heated suit to the electrical system, and felt warmth begin spreading through the wiring. Charged his guns and confirmed they moved freely in their mounts. Checked his parachute harness and confirmed the chest pack was properly attached. The routine was comforting. Familiar actions that pushed fear into a manageable box, somewhere in the back of his mind, where it could not interfere with the work ahead. The engines coughed to life one by one, filling the aircraft with vibration and noise that would continue for the next 8 hours. The bomber taxied into position, joining dozens of others forming up for takeoff. At precisely 8:30 hours, Rikki-Tikki-Tavi rolled down the runway, gathering speed until the wheels left English soil and the nose pointed toward Germany. Moran watched Snetterton Heath recede below him, the familiar landscape replaced by clouds, and then by nothing but empty sky and the tight formation of bombers surrounding his aircraft. The mission had begun, and there was no turning back now. The formation of B-17s crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, each bomber positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against the German fighters that would inevitably come. Eugene Moran had performed well in training, scoring high marks in aircraft recognition and gunnery accuracy. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened when Rikki-Tikki-Tavi reached Bremen. The flak started first, black bursts of shrapnel filling the sky with deadly flowers that bloomed and faded in seconds. The bombers could not maneuver during the bomb run. They had to fly straight and level, while German anti-aircraft batteries threw thousands of explosive shells into predetermined coordinates. Moran watched a B-17 in the formation ahead take a direct hit to its fuel tanks. The aircraft simply disappeared in a ball of orange fire. 10 men converted to ash in the time it took to blink. The bomb bay doors opened. 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbled toward the factories below. Mission accomplished. Now came the hard part, getting home alive. And that was when everything went to hell. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi's No. 2 engine took a direct flak hit as the formation began its turn toward England. The propeller windmilled uselessly, the engine smoking and dead. The bomber began losing speed and altitude. A damaged aircraft falling behind formation was a death sentence. German fighter pilots circled like vultures, watching for stragglers, waiting for the moment when a crippled bomber separated from the protective umbrella of massed defensive fire. Moran saw them coming through his tail position viewport. A dozen Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbing from below, their yellow nose markings clearly visible even at 2,000 yards. Another group of Focke-Wulf 19s diving from above, using the sun as cover. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was about to fight alone against overwhelming odds. The first Messerschmitt came in from 6 o'clock low, exactly the angle Moran had trained for. He pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate behind him and squeezed both triggers. The twin .50 caliber machine guns roared to life, their recoil shaking the entire tail section. Tracer rounds streaked toward the fighter. The German pilot broke off his attack and rolled away, black smoke trailing from his engine cowling. But there were more, many more. The Luftwaffe pilots were professionals. Veterans who had been fighting since 1939. Men who knew exactly how to kill a B-17. They attacked in coordinated pairs, one drawing the gunner's attention, while his wingman lined up a killing shot from a different angle. Moran swung his guns from target to target, firing in short, controlled bursts to prevent his barrels from overheating. Spent brass casings piled up around his knees, clinking against the metal floor with each burst of fire. The smell of cordite filled his cramped compartment, mixing with the metallic taste of fear. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside Rikki-Tikki-Tavi had dropped to 43 degrees below zero. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold still seeped through the fabric, numbing his fingers inside their gloves. His breath formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask. The machine guns grew hot from continuous firing, while his hands went numb from the cold. The contradiction was almost absurd. Burning metal, freezing flesh, both trying to kill him in different ways. The German pilots knew their business. They targeted the engines first, trying to cripple the bomber's ability to stay with the formation. Then they worked methodically on the gunners, eliminating defensive fire position by position. Finally, they would pour 20mm cannon rounds into the fuselage until something vital broke. Fuel tanks, control cables, crew members. It did not matter what died first. The result was always the same. A B-17 falling from the sky in pieces. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them. The distinctive sound of 20mm cannon shells punching through aluminum, a sharp, metallic crack, followed by the whistle of wind through torn metal. Somewhere forward in the aircraft, one of the waist gunners stopped firing. Then the other went silent. The intercom filled with static and fragments of voices, men screaming or calling for help, or reporting damage that Moran could not hear clearly over the roar of his own guns and the howl of wind and the hammer of his racing heart. The bomber shuddered as more cannon rounds struck home. Moran kept firing because there was nothing else he could do. His job was simple: keep the fighters off the tail. Protect the aircraft's most vulnerable angle. Do not stop shooting until the guns jammed or the ammunition ran out, or he died. Those were the only acceptable reasons to cease fire. A Focke-Wulf 190 came in from the 4 o'clock position, slightly off angle, but close enough for a killing shot. Moran swung his guns and walked his tracers across the fighter's flight path. The German pilot tried to break away, but Moran led him perfectly, compensating for wind and altitude and the relative speed of both aircraft exactly as training had taught him. His rounds tore into the Focke-Wulf's wing root. The wing disintegrated in a shower of metal fragments. The fighter spiraled downward, trailing black smoke and pieces of fuselage. First confirmed kill. Moran did not have time to feel anything about it, because 3 more fighters were already lining up their attack runs. Then the pain started. A 20mm cannon round ripped through the tail section and struck Moran's left forearm. He felt the impact like a baseball bat swung by a giant, the bone shattering, hot blood spraying across his flight suit. The shock was immediate and overwhelming, but his right hand kept squeezing the trigger because stopping meant dying. Another round struck his right forearm seconds later. Both arms were hit now, both bones shattered. Blood soaking through his heated suit sleeves, turning the fabric dark and sticky. But his hands still worked. His fingers could still grip. His brain sent signals through shattered bone and torn muscle, and his body obeyed because the alternative was death. Moran wedged his broken arms against the gun handles and used the weight of his upper body to keep the barrels pointed at the fighters. The pain was transcendent, beyond anything he had experienced, beyond anything he could have imagined. But pain did not matter, because German fighters were still out there, and his bomber needed him. More impacts. The vertical stabilizer above him took multiple hits, 20-millimeter rounds punching through the aluminum skin and severing control cables. The cables whipped through the air like metal snakes, missing Moran's head by inches. The tail section began vibrating violently, shaking so hard his teeth rattled and his vision blurred. Something was catastrophically wrong with the aircraft's structural integrity. Moran glanced down at his parachute, the chest pack strapped across his torso that represented his only chance of survival if the bomber went down. Multiple holes perforated the canvas container. Cannon rounds had shredded the silk canopy inside. His parachute was useless. If he had to bail out, he would fall 4 miles to his death with nothing to slow his descent. The realization should have paralyzed him with fear. Instead, it clarified his situation perfectly. There was no escape. There was only fighting until the end. The German attack continued with brutal efficiency. 15 fighters circled the crippled bomber like wolves around wounded prey. Ricky Tikitavi was bleeding altitude and airspeed, the remaining 3 engines straining to keep the aircraft airborne. Forward in the nose section, navigator Jesse Orison was still alive, wounded but conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were dead at their controls, killed by cannon fire that had turned the cockpit into an abattoir. The flight engineer was dead in his turret. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had taken off from Snetterton Heath that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Orison in the nose, Moran in the tail. 40 feet of shattered fuselage between them. Another cannon round struck the bomber. This one hit something critical, something structural. Moran felt the aircraft lurch violently. A grinding sound echoed through the airframe, metal tearing against metal. The vibration intensified until the entire tail section shook like a paint mixer. Then came a sound that would echo in Moran's nightmares for the rest of his life. The shriek of aluminum tearing. The scream of catastrophic structural failure. Ricky Tikitavi was breaking apart. The fuselage split just forward of the tail section, the stress of combat damage and violent maneuvering finally exceeding the aircraft's design limits. Moran watched in horror as the front of the bomber separated and fell away. The wings with their remaining engines, the cockpit with the bodies of his pilot and co-pilot, the nose section where Orison was probably screaming into a dead intercom. All of it tumbling toward the German countryside 24,000 feet below. Eugene Moran was alone now, trapped in a severed tail section, wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed, 24,000 feet above enemy territory. Falling. The laws of physics offered no mercy. Terminal velocity for a human body is approximately 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds and presented significant drag surface area. It would fall faster than a human, but slower than a streamlined object. Moran had perhaps 90 seconds before impact. 90 seconds to live. The severed tail section tumbled through the sky, spinning end over end like a broken toy thrown by an angry child. The rotation threw Moran against the walls of his compartment, his wounded arms screaming with pain that transcended description. Blood sprayed across the interior, painting the metal surfaces red. The wind howled through the torn fuselage where the rest of the aircraft had been attached. The temperature plummeted as the thin air of high altitude mixed with the warmer air closer to ground level, creating a vortex of freezing wind that tore at Moran's flight suit. He should have been paralyzed with terror. He should have curled into a ball and waited for death, accepting the inevitable with whatever dignity he could muster in his final moments. Instead, Eugene Moran did something that defied all logic and reason. He kept fighting. The German fighters were still circling, watching the tail section fall. Perhaps they wanted to confirm the kill. Perhaps they were curious about the aerodynamics of a falling bomber component. Perhaps they simply wanted to witness the final moments of an enemy airman. Whatever their motivation, they made a fatal miscalculation. They flew within range. Moran grabbed his machine guns with broken arms that should not have been able to grip anything. The spinning tail section made aiming nearly impossible. The G-forces pressed him against his seat, then threw him toward the ceiling, then slammed him sideways against the ammunition boxes. His wounded arms bent at angles that made him scream into his oxygen mask. But his hands found the triggers. His fingers squeezed. The twin .50 caliber machine guns roared back to life. Tracers arced wildly through the sky as the tail section rotated. The recoil from the guns altered the spin slightly, creating an unpredictable corkscrew descent that made targeting impossible for both Moran and the German pilots watching him. But Moran did not care about accuracy anymore. He cared about defiance, about refusing to die quietly, about making the enemy pay for every second of his remaining life. The German pilots scattered in confusion and shock. They had never seen anything like this. A man in a falling coffin, wounded and without hope, firing back at them with everything he had. One Messerschmitt took hits across its fuselage as it flew too close to the tumbling wreckage. The pilot broke off and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke, possibly damaged enough to crash. Moran would never know. The altimeter in the tail section was shattered, but Moran could see the ground growing larger through the gaps in the torn metal. Fields and forests and roads, a patchwork of German farmland rushing up to meet him at terminal velocity. The tail section's aerodynamics inadvertently saved his life. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers acted like crude wings, catching air and creating drag. Instead of plummeting straight down in an uncontrolled tumble, the wreckage began to glide in a shallow descent. The spinning slowed gradually. The fall became almost controlled. Almost. Moran estimated his descent rate at approximately 100 feet per second, based on how quickly landscape features grew in his vision. Fast enough to kill him instantly on impact, but slower than a human body in freefall. The stabilizers were buying him time. Seconds, perhaps a full minute. Time that he used to keep firing at any German fighter that ventured close enough to investigate the impossible sight of a tail gunner who refused to accept death. The ground was 5,000 feet below, then 3,000, then 1,000. Trees resolved into individual trunks and branches. Roads became visible as distinct lines cutting through farmland. Buildings appeared as geometric shapes against the landscape. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate that had protected him from frontal attacks. He wrapped his shattered arms around the ammunition boxes, because there was nothing else to hold on to. He took a final breath and waited for impact. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at approximately 100 miles per hour. The impact snapped branches as thick as a man's arm, showering the forest floor with broken wood and pine needles. The vertical stabilizer caught on a trunk and tore away from the main structure, spinning off into the trees. The remaining wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding pieces of aluminum with each successive impact. The sound was catastrophic, a continuous crash of breaking metal and splintering wood that echoed across the German countryside. Moran's head slammed into the steel framework above him. His vision exploded into white light. He felt his ribs crack, multiple fractures radiating through his chest. Both arms bent at angles that arms were never designed to bend, compound fractures adding to the damage already inflicted by cannon fire. The tail section hit another tree, spun sideways, and crashed into the frozen ground with a final, devastating impact that compressed Moran's spine and drove the air from his lungs. Then, silence. Eugene Moran was alive. Barely. He lay in the wreckage, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Both forearms were broken in multiple places, compound fractures with bone protruding through skin that leaked blood onto the frozen German soil. His ribs were shattered. Every breath brought stabbing pain that radiated through his chest. Blood poured from a wound on his head where impact had torn away a portion of his skull, exposing brain tissue to the freezing November air. The farm boy from Wisconsin had just accomplished something that should have been physically impossible. He had fallen 24,000 feet without a functioning parachute and survived. One of only 3 men in the entire Second World War who would achieve this feat. But survival meant nothing if he bled to death in a German forest before anyone found him. And the people who would find him first were not friends. Voices echoed through the trees. German voices. Soldiers coming to investigate the crash site. Eugene Moran lay in the wreckage of Ricky Tikki-Tavi's tail section, barely conscious, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him 3 times over, and listened to the sound of boots crunching through snow. The farm boy from Wisconsin had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute, but survival meant nothing if he bled to death in a German forest, or if the soldiers coming toward him decided a wounded American airman was not worth the trouble of keeping alive. The German soldiers emerged from the trees with rifles raised, their breath forming clouds in the freezing November air. They surrounded the wreckage and stared at the impossible sight before them. A severed tail section of a B-17. A young American, lying in the snow with both arms shattered, his skull partially exposed, blood pooling beneath him. He should have been dead. Everything about the scene suggested he should have been dead. But his chest was rising and falling. His eyes were tracking movement. Eugene Moran was alive. One soldier shouted orders. Another ran back toward the road, presumably to summon an officer or medical personnel. The remaining soldiers searched Moran roughly, ignoring his screams as they moved his shattered arms to check for weapons. They found his dog tags, his rank insignia, his ruined parachute. They photographed the wreckage for intelligence purposes, documenting the damage to American bomber construction. They examined the twin .50 caliber machine guns that Moran had fired all the way down, the barrels still warm despite the freezing temperature. They left him lying on the frozen ground while they completed their investigation, because a dying enemy did not warrant immediate medical attention. An officer arrived within the hour, his uniform indicating Wehrmacht rather than SS, which might have made the difference between summary execution and prisoner status. He looked at Moran's wounds and shook his head. The American was clearly dying. Compound fractures in both arms, multiple broken ribs, exposed brain tissue, severe blood loss. Hypothermia setting in rapidly. Transporting him anywhere seemed pointless. But orders were orders. Downed airmen were to be captured and interrogated if possible. Dead airmen provided no intelligence about American bomber tactics, formations, or capabilities. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart with no stretcher, no blankets, no medical attention. Just rough wood against his shattered body. The cart bounced along frozen roads for hours, each jolt sending fresh waves of agony through his broken ribs and fractured arms. The wound on his skull had stopped bleeding only because the cold had frozen the blood into a dark crust that covered the exposed tissue. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of pain and cold and the certainty that he was going to die soon. The cart delivered him to a German military facility somewhere in the Bremen area. Moran could not identify what kind of facility through his blurred vision and fragmentary consciousness. He remembered being carried inside. He remembered lying on a concrete floor. He remembered German voices discussing him as if he were already a corpse, debating whether moving him to a proper medical facility was worth the fuel and manpower. No doctor came that first night, no medic. No one offered water or bandages or morphine. The Germans had limited medical supplies in late 1943. Their resources stretched thin by years of war on multiple fronts. They were not about to waste precious medications on an enemy airman who would probably die regardless of treatment. Moran lay on that concrete floor while his wounds festered and his body temperature dropped, and infection began spreading through his bloodstream. 2 days passed. Moran's wounds became infected, the exposed brain tissue beginning to swell as bacteria multiplied in the damaged tissue. His broken arms turned purple and black, gangrene setting in as blood circulation was cut off by shattered bone and torn muscle. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread to his blood and kill him within days. Without intervention, Eugene Moran had perhaps 48 hours remaining. The German guards watched him deteriorate. Some seemed indifferent, having seen too much death to care about one more dying enemy. Others appeared almost sympathetic, recognizing that Moran was just a young man doing his duty, no different from German soldiers dying in Russia or Africa or Italy. But none of them had the authority or resources to save him. American bombers had been destroying German cities for months. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors were overwhelmed with German casualties. Enemy airmen ranked far below German soldiers and civilians on the priority list. On the third day, Moran was transported again. Another cart, another agonizing journey over frozen roads, his consciousness fading with each kilometer. This time, his destination was a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building in occupied territory where wounded Allied airmen were held until they recovered enough to be sent to permanent camps. The hospital was understaffed and undersupplied, operating with a fraction of the personnel and equipment needed to handle the steady flow of wounded prisoners arriving from downed bombers. German military doctors performed triage on incoming prisoners according to brutal mathematics. Those with survivable wounds, who could be stabilized with minimal resources, received treatment. Those deemed beyond saving were left to die as comfortably as possible, given the circumstances. Moran's injuries placed him firmly in the second category. Compound fractures in both arms, shattered ribs, exposed brain tissue, severe infection spreading through his system. The doctors took one look at him and moved on to more promising cases. But the hospital held a secret that would save Eugene Moran's life. Among the prisoners were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians captured on the Eastern Front during Germany's invasion of Yugoslavia. The Germans had pressed them into service treating wounded Allied prisoners, a practical solution that freed German doctors for their own casualties while still maintaining some level of medical care for prisoners, as required by Geneva Convention obligations. The Serbian doctors worked with inadequate equipment and almost no proper medications, performing surgeries that would have been considered medieval by American standards. The Serbian doctors examined Moran and made a decision that defied medical logic. They would try to save him. Not because anyone ordered them to, not because they had the proper tools or medications, simply because he was a wounded human being, and they were physicians who had taken oaths to preserve life, regardless of nationality or circumstance. They looked at the shattered American lying on their examination table and saw not an enemy, but a patient who deserved whatever chance they could provide. The surgery lasted 7 hours. They worked with instruments designed for field operations, not complex orthopedic procedures or neurosurgery. No proper anesthesia, only local numbing agents that barely dulled the pain radiating through Moran's nervous system. He drifted in and out of consciousness as they set his broken bones with metal pins and wire salvaged from other sources. They cleaned infected tissue from his wounds, cutting away dead flesh and draining pus from the compound fractures. They removed bone fragments from his skull and covered the exposed brain tissue with what skin and tissue they could salvage from the surrounding area. The Serbian doctors fashioned a metal plate from available materials and attached it to Moran's skull, covering the wound where impact had torn away bone and exposed his brain to the elements. The plate was crude by modern standards, just a curved piece of metal bent to roughly match the contour of his skull and secured with wire sutures. But it was effective enough to protect the vulnerable tissue beneath and prevent further infection from reaching his brain. They splinted his arms with wooden boards and wrapped them in bandages torn from sheets, creating immobilization that would allow the bones to begin healing if Moran's body could fight off the infection long enough. They did everything possible with almost nothing available, improvising solutions that would have shocked trained surgeons in proper facilities. When the surgery was over, they told Moran the truth in broken English. The next 72 hours would determine whether he lived or died. His body had to fight off the remaining infection. His bones had to begin healing. His brain had to avoid swelling further beneath the crude metal plate. There was nothing more they could do except wait. Eugene Moran's survival now depended entirely on his own will to live, the same stubborn determination that had kept him firing his machine guns as his bomber disintegrated around him 4 miles above Germany. The fever came on the first night after surgery. Moran's temperature climbed to 104 degrees. His body shook with violent chills despite the sweat pouring from his skin, soaking through the thin blanket covering him. The Serbian doctors monitored him as closely as their limited resources and other patients allowed. They changed his bandages when they could. They forced water between his cracked lips. They waited. Infection was the great killer in military hospitals during World War II. Antibiotics existed, but were almost impossible to obtain in German prisoner of war facilities, reserved for German soldiers and civilians. The doctors had cleaned Moran's wounds as thoroughly as they could, but bacteria had already entered his bloodstream before surgery. His immune system was fighting a microscopic war inside his own body, white blood cells struggling to contain the bacterial invasion before it overwhelmed his organs. The second night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium, his fevered brain unable to distinguish memory from present reality. He called out for his mother back in Wisconsin. He screamed warnings to crewmates who were already dead. He relived the moment when Ricky Tiki Tavi broke apart, his unconscious mind replaying the trauma over and over in fragmentary nightmares. The other wounded prisoners in the hospital ward listened to his ravings and wondered if they would wake to find him dead. The Serbian doctors took turns sitting with him through the long night. They had no medicine to offer beyond what they had already administered. No antibiotics to fight the infection. No painkillers to ease his suffering. Only their presence. Only cold cloths pressed against his burning forehead. Only whispered encouragement in accented English that he probably could not hear through the fever dreams consuming his consciousness. On the third morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings for the first time in days. He was alive. The infection had not killed him. His immune system had won the microscopic battle that modern medicine could not fight. The Serbian doctors examined his wounds and found the first encouraging signs of healing. The tissue around his skull plate was beginning to close, forming scar tissue that would protect the vulnerable area. The broken bones in his arms were starting to knit together beneath the splints and bandages. Recovery would take months, perhaps years. The damage to his body was extensive and permanent. But Eugene Moran was going to survive. Word spread through the hospital about the American who fell 4 miles without a parachute. The tail gunner who kept shooting as his bomber disintegrated. The man who should have died a dozen times but refused to stop breathing. German guards came to look at him, with expressions mixing respect and disbelief. Other prisoners asked to hear his story, desperate for evidence that survival against impossible odds was actually possible. 6 weeks after the crash, Moran could walk again. His arms remained in splints, the bones healing slowly but successfully. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches that would plague him for the rest of his life. His ribs ached with every breath, a reminder of impact forces that should have killed him instantly. But he was mobile. He was conscious. He was ready for whatever came next. The Germans processed him with bureaucratic efficiency. Name, rank, serial number, service branch, unit assignment. They photographed him for their records. A thin young man with hollow cheeks and bandaged arms staring into the camera, with eyes that had seen too much death for someone barely 20 years old. His first permanent camp was Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a compound specifically designed to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences surrounded wooden barracks. Guard towers equipped with machine guns overlooked the compound. Searchlights swept the grounds at night. Thousands of American and British airmen filled the camp, men who had been shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. The camp provided minimal rations according to Geneva Convention requirements. Thin soup made from turnips or potatoes. Black bread that tasted like sawdust. Occasionally, small portions of ersatz coffee or unidentifiable meat. Red Cross packages supplemented the diet when they arrived, but deliveries were unpredictable and often pilfered by guards before reaching prisoners. Most prisoners lost 20 or 30 pounds during their captivity. Some lost more. Moran's body continued healing through the brutal winter of 1943 to 1944. His arms regained function, though they would never be as strong as before the injuries. The headaches from his skull injury became less frequent, but never completely disappeared. The nightmares about the crash intensified, his sleeping mind replaying the moment of structural failure over and over. But he was alive. He was surviving. And 17 months of captivity still stretched ahead of him. Months that would test his endurance in ways that made surviving the fall seem almost easy in comparison. But this story is not just about Eugene Moran's survival. It is about what his survival represented in the larger context of the air war over Europe. Because while Moran was fighting for his life in a German hospital, the strategic bombing campaign was continuing, and men were dying by the hundreds in the same skies where Rikki Tikki Tavi had been destroyed. And the question that would define the rest of the war was whether the losses could be sustained long enough to achieve victory, or whether the entire campaign would collapse under the weight of its own casualties before Germany could be defeated. Viết phần 4, kịch bản video lịch sử quân sự Thế chiến II, yêu cầu 2.500 đến 3.500 từ. Thời lượng đọc voice AI khoảng 18 đến 22 phút. Cấu trúc chi tiết như sau. Cấu trúc phần 4. 1. Recap cộng hức tiếp nối. 150 đến 200 từ. Khoảng 1 đến 1,5 phút. Tóm tắt hành trình. 70 đến 90 từ. Ý tưởng điên rồ đến thử nghiệm. Đến Paste It. 10 giờ 46 phút. The winter of 1944 stretched into 1945, and Eugene Moran remained a prisoner in German hands. From the fall at 24,000 feet, to the Serbian doctors who saved his life, to the camps where he waited for liberation, 17 months passed in a blur of pain and survival, and stubborn refusal to surrender. But while Moran fought his private war against death and captivity, the strategic bombing campaign that had sent him into German skies was transforming in ways that would validate every sacrifice made by crews like his. The question that haunted every Bomber Command decision during those brutal months of 1943 was whether the losses could be sustained long enough to break Germany's industrial capacity. The answer would come not from one innovation, but from a combination of tactical evolution, technological advancement, and the accumulated lessons learned from thousands of young men who climbed into aluminum bombers and flew into hell. By early 1945, Soviet forces were advancing from the east and Allied armies were pushing from the west. Germany was being crushed between two unstoppable forces. The prisoners in Stalag Luft 4 could hear distant artillery growing louder each day. They could see German guards growing increasingly nervous. Something fundamental was about to change. On February 6, 1945, that change came with devastating suddenness. Soviet troops were approaching the camp. German commanders ordered an immediate evacuation. All prisoners would march west on foot into the German interior. Destination unknown, duration unknown. Refusal meant execution. The prisoners assembled in the frozen compound, where temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Many men had no winter coats, no gloves, no proper boots. They had been surviving on starvation rations for months, their bodies already weakened by malnutrition and disease. And now they were expected to walk across Germany in the coldest winter in decades. The column stretched for miles when it finally began moving, thousands of Allied airmen trudging through snow and ice. German guards marched alongside with rifles ready. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. Anyone who tried to escape would be shot. Walk or die. Eugene Moran had survived a 4-mile fall from the sky. He had survived catastrophic injuries and crude surgery and raging infection. Now he faced 600 miles of frozen roads with a body that had never fully healed from the crash 17 months earlier. His arms remained weak and prone to pain. The metal plate in his skull conducted the freezing temperatures directly into his brain, creating headaches that felt like ice picks driven through his forehead. His ribs ached with every breath of frigid air. But he put one foot in front of the other and refused to stop, because stopping meant dying. And Eugene Moran had not survived this long to die on a frozen German road. The march would later become known as the Black March, one of the longest forced marches of Allied prisoners in European history. 86 days of walking through blizzards and freezing rain, sleeping in barns filled with animal waste, drinking from ditches contaminated with human sewage, eating whatever could be stolen or scavenged from the devastated German countryside. An estimated 1,500 American and British airmen died during the Black March. Pneumonia killed hundreds. Dysentery killed hundreds more. Typhus spread through the column like wildfire. Frostbite turned fingers and toes black, requiring amputations that prisoners performed on each other with stolen knives. Bullets from guards who decided a straggler was not worth waiting for. The prisoners walked 15 to 20 miles each day through snow that sometimes reached their knees. They slept in frozen barns when they were lucky, on open ground when they were not. They ate raw potatoes stolen from fields and drank melted snow because the streams were contaminated with runoff from bombed cities and destroyed infrastructure. Moran's body protested every step. The arms that had been shattered by 20-millimeter cannon fire ached constantly in the cold. His improperly healed ribs sent stabbing pain through his chest with every breath. But he kept walking, because the alternative was unacceptable. Men died around him daily. Some collapsed in the snow and never got up, their bodies left behind as the column moved forward. Others developed fevers that consumed them within hours, typhus or pneumonia, burning through their weakened systems. Guards shot prisoners who could not keep pace. Single rifle shots, echoing across the frozen landscape. The column left a trail of bodies across the German countryside, like markers on a map of suffering. But Eugene Moran kept walking, with the same stubborn determination that had kept him firing his machine guns as Ricky Tikki Tavi disintegrated around him. By April 1945, the column had covered nearly 500 miles. The prisoners could hear Allied artillery growing louder each day, the rumble of American and British guns pounding German positions. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. Germany was collapsing. Liberation was coming. On April 26, 1945, the march ended. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column near the Elbe River. The German guards threw down their weapons and surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. After years of captivity, after months of marching, after countless moments when death seemed certain, they were free. Eugene Moran weighed 93 pounds when American medics found him. He had entered the army at 150 pounds. The crash, the surgeries, the camps, and the Black March had stripped away nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. But he was alive. He had survived everything Germany could throw at him. The farm boy from Wisconsin who fell 4 miles and refused to die. Medical personnel rushed to treat the liberated prisoners. Many required immediate hospitalization. Typhus had spread through the column during the march. Pneumonia was rampant. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes that would need amputation. The doctors worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been systematically starved and brutalized for months or years. They processed Moran's case with growing astonishment. His service record documented the impossible. Shot down over Bremen on November 29, 1943. Aircraft destroyed by enemy action. Fell 24,000 feet in severed tail section without functional parachute. Survived impact. Captured by enemy forces. Held as prisoner of war for 17 months. Survived forced march of approximately 600 miles. Military historians would later confirm that only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes. Eugene Moran was one of them. The other 2 had similar stories of wreckage riding, where pieces of destroyed aircraft slowed their descent enough to make survival theoretically possible, though still monumentally improbable. All 3 cases were considered miraculous, statistical anomalies that defied the physics of terminal velocity and impact forces. The Army awarded Moran 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds he sustained during the attack on his bomber, 1 for each arm shattered by German cannon fire. They gave him the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service with the 8th Air Force. They gave him the European Theater Medal and the Good Conduct Medal. They gave him an honorable discharge on December 1, 1945, and sent him home to Wisconsin with a body that would never fully recover and memories that would never fully fade. But di sản thực sự của anh ta không nằm ở các huân chương. The 96th Bomb Group had lost 938 men during the war, 206 aircraft destroyed, thousands of missions flown over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Moran's survival was a statistical anomaly in an organization defined by catastrophic losses, but his story represented something larger than individual survival. It represented the price paid by an entire generation of young men who climbed into bombers and flew into impossible odds because someone had to stop fascism. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe remains one of the most controversial military operations in history. Did it shorten the war? Did it save Allied lives by destroying German industry? Or did it simply transfer the burden of combat from ground soldiers to air crews, while inflicting horrific casualties on both sides? The statistics offer partial answers. The 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men killed in action over Europe. Another 23,000 were wounded. Nearly 21,000 were taken prisoner. 70,000 total casualties from a force that peaked at 350,000 personnel. A casualty rate approaching 20%. But those 70,000 casualties flew more than 300,000 combat sorties and dropped more than 700,000 tons of bombs on German industrial targets. They destroyed aircraft factories, oil refineries, ball bearing plants, and transportation networks. They forced Germany to divert massive resources to air defense, resources that could not be used on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces or in France against Allied ground troops. They reduced German aircraft production by an estimated 40% in 1944 alone. They crippled the fuel supply for German tanks and aircraft. They made Allied invasion and advance possible by degrading German ability to resist. Eugene Moran's fall from the sky represented one small moment in that massive campaign. One young man in one bomber on one mission over one city. But multiply that moment by hundreds of thousands of missions, and the scale becomes comprehensible. Every bomber crew that took off from England faced the same mathematics of survival. Every tail gunner sat alone in his compartment, watching for fighters. Every young man climbed into an aircraft knowing the statistics, knowing the losses, knowing most crews did not complete their 25 missions. They flew anyway. The tail gunner position that Moran occupied on November 29, 1943, was eventually recognized as one of the most dangerous jobs in military aviation. Tail gunners suffered disproportionately high casualty rates because German fighters specifically targeted them to eliminate defensive fire before attacking the bomber. The position was eventually modified in later aircraft designs. The B-29 Super Fortress, which entered service in 1944, featured remote-controlled defensive turrets that allowed gunners to operate from safer positions inside the aircraft rather than isolated compartments at the tail. But no technological innovation could eliminate the fundamental reality of strategic bombing. Young men had to fly into defended airspace and accept horrific casualty rates to destroy the enemy's ability to make war. The question was never whether losses were acceptable. The question was whether the mission could be accomplished before the losses became unsustainable. By spring 1945, when Moran was liberated, the answer was clear. The bombing campaign had succeeded. Germany's industrial capacity was shattered. Its fuel supplies were exhausted. Its transportation network was destroyed. The Third Reich was collapsing not just from ground invasion, but from the cumulative destruction rained down from bombers like Rikki-Tikki-Tavi. Eugene Moran returned to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin in late 1945. He was 21 years old. He had aged decades. The farm boy who dreamed of flight while watching planes pass overhead had flown into combat and fallen from the sky, and survived imprisonment and marched 600 miles through frozen Germany. Now, he had to figure out how to build a life after everything he had endured. He married Margaret Finley a few months after returning home. She was a local girl who had known him before the war, who saw past the physical scars and the hollow eyes and the nightmares that woke him screaming. They built a life together on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the same landscape where Moran had grown up. They had 9 children. Moran worked his farm. He attended church on Sundays. He watched his grandchildren grow. He rarely spoke about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone who asked. The experiences were too painful, the losses too profound. 8 of his crewmates had died on Rikki-Tikki-Tavi. Countless friends had perished in the camps and on the Black March. Talking about it meant reliving it, so he stayed silent for more than 60 years. The physical wounds never fully healed. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. His arms remained weak and prone to pain in cold weather. His ribs ached when storms approached. His body carried the evidence of November 29, 1943, until his final breath. But Eugene Moran lived. He raised his family. He worked his land. He outlived most of his fellow prisoners and nearly all of his fellow crewmen. The farm boy who should have died a dozen times over lived to see the 21st century. In 2007, more than 6 decades after the war ended, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new honor called the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. They chose Eugene Moran as the first recipient. Finally, officially, his state recognized what he had endured and what he had survived. The award ceremony brought attention to his story after decades of silence. Journalists interviewed him. Historians documented his account. A local teacher named John Armster became fascinated by the tale and began conducting extensive interviews with Moran and his family, research that would eventually become a book called Tailspin, published in 2022. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove honored Moran by naming a street after him, Eugene Moran Way, a permanent marker in the community where he was born, where he returned after the war, where he spent the rest of his life. The recognition came late, as it often does for veterans whose heroism was overshadowed by larger narratives of victory and celebration. But it came. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014. He was 89 years old. 7 decades had passed since the day German flak cut his bomber in half and sent him tumbling 4 miles toward Earth. 7 decades since he kept firing his machine guns while the world spun around him. 7 decades since Serbian doctors saved his life with crude tools and impossible skill. His obituary noted that he lived by a simple philosophy: "I would rather wear out than rust out." The words of a man who refused to surrender.
Nhưng bài học lớn nhất không phải về kỹ thuật hay chiến thuật.
The real lesson of Eugene Moran's story is not about aircraft design or defensive gunnery or strategic bombing effectiveness. It is about human resilience in the face of impossible odds, about the stubborn determination to keep fighting when every rational calculation says surrender, about ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances who somehow find the strength to survive. Moran was not a hero in the conventional Hollywood sense. He did not single-handedly win battles or make strategic decisions that altered the course of the war. He was a farm boy from Wisconsin who ended up in the tail section of a bomber. He did his job. He kept shooting when fighters attacked. He kept breathing when his aircraft broke apart. He kept walking when guards forced prisoners across frozen Germany. He kept living when his body had every reason to quit. That kind of heroism does not come with dramatic music or inspiring speeches. It comes from deep reserves of character that most people never know they possess until circumstances demand it. Eugene Moran discovered those reserves at 19 years old, when his bomber disintegrated around him. He drew on them again during 17 months of captivity. He relied on them one final time during the Black March. And then he carried them home to Wisconsin and used them to build a quiet life that honored the crewmates who never returned.
Và có một chi tiết cuối cùng mà hầu hết mọi người không biết.
When researchers examined German military records decades after the war, they found intelligence reports describing the tail section that fell near Bremen on November 29, 1943. German officers had documented the wreckage, photographed the twin .50 caliber guns, interviewed guards who witnessed Moran firing at fighters during his descent. The reports expressed disbelief that anyone could survive such a fall, but they also noted something else. They noted respect. The German military had recognized what Moran represented, not an enemy to be hated, but a warrior who embodied qualities they understood. Courage under fire, refusal to surrender, commitment to duty regardless of personal cost. The German officers who processed his capture, and the guards who watched him recover, and the soldiers who marched him across their collapsing country, all saw the same thing. A young man who should have died, but refused to accept that outcome. One German guard later told researchers that Moran reminded him of his own son, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over England in 1942. Two young men from different countries who climbed in the aircraft and flew into combat because their nations demanded it. Both survived being shot down. Both endured captivity. Both carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The guard said he treated Moran with as much kindness as circumstances allowed, because he hoped someone in England was showing his son the same consideration. War creates enemies, but it also creates unexpected connections between people who recognize shared humanity beneath the uniforms and flags. Eugene Moran's survival was not just a triumph of individual will. It was enabled by Serbian doctors who chose to save an enemy, by German guards who provided just enough mercy to keep him alive, by fellow prisoners who shared their meager rations during the Black March, by American soldiers who liberated him when he weighed 93 pounds and looked like death. Survival, it turns out, is often a collective achievement. From a farm boy with a dream of flight, to a tail gunner who fell 4 miles and kept fighting, to a prisoner who walked 600 miles through frozen Germany, to a veteran who lived 89 years and raised 9 children. Eugene Moran's journey encompassed the entire spectrum of human experience, compressed into a few extraordinary years. He proved that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary endurance when circumstances demand it. He demonstrated that survival is not about being the strongest or the smartest, but about refusing to quit when quitting would be so much easier. And because of men like him, because of the 26,000 airmen who died over Europe, and the 23,000 who were wounded, and the 21,000 who were captured, the strategic bombing campaign succeeded. Germany's industrial capacity was destroyed. Its ability to wage war was broken. The Third Reich collapsed. The war in Europe ended. Victory came at a price measured in shattered bodies and psychological trauma, and young men who never came home. But it came. That is the power of stubborn courage. The refusal to accept defeat, even when falling from the sky without a parachute. The determination to keep breathing when every wound says die. The commitment to walk 1 more mile when the body has nothing left to give. Eugene Moran embodied that power on November 29, 1943, and he carried it for the rest of his life. His story deserves to be remembered, not because it was unique, but because it represented thousands of similar stories from young men who climbed into bombers and flew into hell and somehow came home. They were not supermen. They were farm boys and factory workers and shop clerks who found reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. And they changed the world.